All right, let's go. Number 10, opium. In the summer of 1963, archaeologist Hector Catling was cataloging ceramic finds from a dig site at Hala Sultan Teki on the southern coast of Cyprus when he identified something that had been passing through museum collections for decades without anyone recognizing what it was. A small ceramic vessel, squat and round, with a narrow neck and a surface deliberately molded to mimic the seed capsule of Papaver somniferum, the opium poppy. The vessel dated to approximately 1200 BCE. It had been recovered not from a household storage area, not from a merchant quarter, but from a sanctuary. Someone had been keeping opium in a sacred space. The alkaloid residue confirmed by later analysis was unambiguous. The shape of the vessel, designed with architectural precision to replicate the inverted capsule of the poppy as it appears when ripe for harvesting, was not coincidence. A ceramic built to contain and invoke the identity of the poppy would not end up in a sanctuary by accident. Hala Sultan Teki was, based on the broader excavation record, a functioning ritual site. The priests who worked there kept opium. The question that Catling's identification made unavoidable was what they did with it. The poppy's sacred history in the ancient Mediterranean is older than Cyprus's Bronze Age sanctuaries by more than 1,000 years. Sumerian clay tablets from Ur III, dated to approximately 2100 BC, refer to a plant called hulgil, the joy plant. The context in which hulgil appears shifts across the corpus. Some tablets are medical, some are commercial, tracking quantities traded between cities. Some are religious, referencing the plant in context with no interpretation other than ritual use. The Sumerian priestly class does not appear to have considered these three categories as separate. The plant crossed all three simultaneously. Its capacity to dissolve the experience of the present moment, to suspend grief, to make the boundary between the living and whatever lay beyond it temporarily permeable, these were not secondary effects. They were the point. By the New Kingdom period in Egypt, around 1550 BCE, the Ebers Papyrus was cataloging opium preparations with the same clinical specificity it applied to wound treatment and fever medicine. The plant appears under its Egyptian name, sheepan. The medical applications are documented clearly. What the papyrus does not record, because priestly medical texts were not the place to record it, is the ritual dimension. That shows up in the mortuary evidence. But here's where the archaeology of ancient opium becomes impossible to frame as purely medical. At Megiddo in modern Israel, ivory vessels with poppy alkaloid residue were recovered from cremation burial contexts dated to around 1300 BCE, placed with the dead, not displayed in a temple where the living could access them, placed inside the burial to accompany whoever was going where the dead go. At Deir el-Bahari on the west bank of the Nile, poppy vessels appear repeatedly in New Kingdom mortuary equipment, deposited in tombs that contain the specific tools of passage, the canopic jars, the ushabtis, the papyrus scrolls of the Book of the Dead. The poppy was not a medicine that appeared in funerary contexts incidentally. It was being treated as something that belonged at the threshold. Homer's Nepenthe, the drug given to Helen by Polydamna of Egypt, described in the Odyssey as capable of dissolving all memory of grief so completely that the death of a parent or child would produce no sorrow, has no pharmacologically coherent candidate besides opium. The specific effects Homer describes are not euphoria, not they are the complete suspension of emotional pain so total that loss produces nothing. That is the characteristic effect of the opioid receptor system. Polydamna is identified as Egyptian. The vessel Catling found is Egyptian Bronze Age. The trajectories converge. What the ancient world understood across centuries and cultures was that the poppy dissolved the walls the living had built against the dead, not by producing visions, by removing the defenses that made the weight of mortality bearable. In that dissolved state, the boundary between the living and those who had crossed it became, for the duration of the drug's action, something negotiable. The trading archaeology makes the scale of this clearer. Cypriot base ring juglets, the ceramic form Catling identified, have been found in contexts across the eastern Mediterranean, in the Mycenaean palace stores at Tiryns, in funerary deposits at Ugarit, in Egyptian tomb contexts at Amarna. When Cypriot merchants shipped poppy-shaped vessels across the Bronze Age Mediterranean, they were not shipping a commodity, they were shipping a sacred technology. The shape of the vessel was its own label, declaring what was inside and who it was intended for. What the priests who received those vessels did with the contents, whether they administered the drug in funerary rites, whether they used it to prepare communicants for encounters with the dead, whether they understood the poppy's effect on the boundary between between life and what came after it in the same terms the Sumerian tablets suggest is not recorded. The records that survive from Bronze Age priestly practice are the records of administration and trade. The records of what actually happened in the sanctuaries when the vessels were opened were maintained in memory and ceremony, and were gone before anyone thought to preserve them in clay. The poppy still grows in the same latitudes where the Bronze Age priests pressed its capsules into clay. The mechanism by which it removes the experience of loss has been mapped at the receptor level. The ceremonies that directed that mechanism toward a conversation across the boundary of death were dismantled before anyone thought to preserve them. Number 9. Henbane. In the Oseberg ship burial in Norway, excavated in 1904 and dated to 834 C, 2 women were interred in a Viking longship dragged inland and covered under a burial mound. The women, one approximately 50 years old, one approximately 70 or 80, were accompanied by extraordinary grave goods, carved wooden carts, tapestries, 14 horses, 6 dogs, and equipment that archaeologists gradually identified as associated with high-status ritual function. Among the smaller organic finds, examined as chemical analysis of burial materials improved over subsequent decades, were seeds, small, kidney-shaped seeds in a leather pouch associated with the older woman. Iosiamos Niger. Henbane, the older woman at Oseberg, appears, from the totality of the burial evidence, to have been a practitioner of Saer, the Norse shamanic tradition of traveling between worlds to gain knowledge and communicate with the dead. The henbane was not a personal medicine. It was a professional tool. Henbane contains scopolamine and hyoscyamine. They are deliriants, not psychedelics. The distinction matters more than it might first appear. A psychedelic creates visions layered over perceived reality. A deliriant replaces reality entirely. The user experiences a fully realized environment that is not the one they physically occupy, populated by people who are not present, conducting conversations that did not occur. Memory of the experience is typically fragmented or absent. The dose that produces this effect sits uncomfortably close to the dose that stops the heart. What made henbane the specific tool of Northern European shamanic practice, rather than psilocybin mushrooms, which also grow in Nordic latitudes, was this precise quality. It did not augment reality. It removed you from it completely. The Vilva, the seeress, did not want visions superimposed on the world around her. She wanted to leave this world entirely and travel to where the dead were. The pharmacological profile of henbane is the only substance available in Northern Europe that reliably produces that specific outcome. But here's where the henbane tradition extends beyond the Norse world in ways that demand a different explanation. The oracle at Delphi conducted her prophetic work above a geological vent in a sanctuary built into the mountainside at Delphi. Geologists John Hale and Gilles de Boer confirmed in a 2001 paper in the journal Geology that 2 fault lines intersect directly beneath the sanctuary, releasing ethylene and other petrochemical gases from deep in the rock. Whether the pneuma, the sacred vapor the ancient sources described the Pythia inhaling, was entirely geological, or whether it was supplemented by the burning of henbane in ritual censers remains debated. The classical sources are too fragmentary to resolve. What is not debated is the oracle's function. She mediated communications with the dead. Generals asked what the honored dead would sanction. Grieving families asked what the dead required. The oracle was an institutionalized dead communication service operating for 9 centuries on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, and the henbane ash recovered from sanctuary-adjacent sites is consistent with active use. Tacitus, writing as Germania in 98 C, described Germanic warriors entering battle in states that no normal psychology could explain. Men who neither felt nor acknowledged wounds, who could not be stopped by pain, who continued fighting in conditions that should have made combat impossible. Tacitus called them berserkers, and attributed their state to a specific frenzy that descended upon them before battle. The Norse sagas are more specific. The berserker tradition involved ritual preparation, a deliberate chemical alteration of consciousness before combat. Several researchers, including Otto Hegg in his 1944 work on, and more recently Neil Price at Uppsala University in his 2002 study of Saer practice, have examined the pharmacological consistency between henbane's scopolamine profile and the berserker state. Aggression without pain sensation, violence without memory, a dissociation from ordinary human response that was both the berserker's weapon and the source of the dread they inspired. The archaeology does not permit a firm conclusion. The pharmacological coherence is close enough that dismissal is intellectually uncomfortable. The tradition appears again in the medieval European witch trial records, in confessions obtained from women across Germany, France, and England in the 15th and 16th centuries. Confessions whose pharmacological pharmacological consistency across geographically separate cases is difficult to explain away, the descriptions are remarkably uniform. They had flown. They had left their bodies, traveled through the night, arrived at gatherings, and returned before dawn. The witch's ointment described in trial documents contained henbane, datura, and belladonna applied to the skin in areas of high vascular absorption. Scopolamine absorbed transdermally produces vivid sensations of bodily flight and the perception of leaving the physical form. The women were not lying. Within the pharmacological reality the plant had created, they had gone exactly where they said they went. The Oseberg Vilva's leather pouch, the oracle's sanctuary vapor, the confessions of women burned for what a plant had shown them, all pointing in the same direction. Henbane was a transit system. The destination was the same every time. Number 8. Peyote. In 2005, a research team led by anthropologist Carolyn Boyd of Texas State University published findings from peyote button residue recovered from ritual contexts in rock shelters in the lower Pecos River region of southwestern Texas. The radiocarbon date placed the deposit at approximately 3700 BCE. The painted iconography surrounding the deposit depicted figures in states of transformation, their bodies dissolving at the edges, figures consuming cactus, figures communicating with entities rendered as wholly non-human. 50,700 years old. The oldest confirmed archaeological evidence for intentional peyote use in North America. The tradition it implies almost certainly predates the evidence. Lophophora williamsi is a small, spineless cactus that grows in the Chihuahuan Desert of northern Mexico and southern Texas. It rises about 2 inches above the soil, a gray-green button sitting nearly flat against the ground. Beneath it, the root system extends deep into the desert hardpan. A mature plant can take a decade to reach the surface. A ceremonial dose typically involves consuming between 5 and 12 buttons over the course of a night that begins at dusk and ends after dawn. The experience can last 18 hours. For the Vixritari, the Huichol people of the Sierra Madre Occidental, the central act of the peyote ceremony is not the ingestion of the cactus. It is the transformation that follows. The ceremony includes a point at which the participants ritually become their ancestors. They take the names of the dead. They speak in the voices of those who came before. The peyote ceremony is not a journey to see beautiful things. It is a mechanism by which the living become temporarily permeable to the dead, by which the boundary between the living and the ancestral line becomes something that can be traversed in both directions. This is stated plainly, not as metaphor. The ancestors attend. The living and the dead are, for the duration of the ceremony, in the same place. But here's where the distribution of peyote ceremony complicates any narrative of isolated cultural development. The Native American church, which grew from the peyote ceremony traditions of the Kiowa, the Comanche, and subsequently spread to over 50 Native American nations across the continent during the 19th and 20th centuries, incorporated dead communication as a primary structural element from its earliest documented forms. The ceremony includes explicit invitations to deceased relatives, periods of silence understood as listening to the dead speak, and a formal acknowledgement at the close of the night that the ancestors were present. These parallel the Vixritari structure closely, despite originating in geographically separate traditions that arrived at peyote ceremony through different histories. Mescaline's action on serotonin 2A receptors produces a loosening of the ego boundary, the cognitive structure that separates self from non-self. Under its influence, the sensation of another consciousness overlapping the experiencer's own field of awareness is reported consistently enough across cultures that it has become a research category. The Vixritari did not derive this from pharmacology textbooks. They discovered it by taking the plant into the desert, in the dark, and recording what happened across 100 generations. 5,700 years of that kind of attention produces a precise understanding of what the plant does to the living and the dead. Number 7. Datura. In the Santa Barbara backcountry of California, the painted surfaces of rock shelters occupied by the Chumash people contain imagery that art historians dated. Through stylistic analysis and radiocarbon techniques applied to organic material within the paint layers to approximately 900 to 1200 C. The paintings are distinctive, elongated figures with distorted proportions, limbs stretched beyond human anatomy, bodies rendered in the visual language of a state the researchers who study them call visionary. Beneath several of the most complex murals in the soil of the shelter floor were remnants of ritual deposits, Jimson weed, Datura wrightii, placed there not scattered accidentally, placed in the space below the imagery it had apparently generated. The Chumash ritual use of datura, which they called momoi, is documented in ethnographic accounts beginning in the late 18th century and is understood to have served a specific function, initiation into communication with the dead. Chumash initiation ceremonies used datura to allow initiates to cross into the domain of the dead and return with the rock art above the deposits is understood as the visual record of what the initiates found on that crossing. The chemistry that makes this coherent is also the chemistry that makes datura the most dangerous plant on this. Datura contains atropine, scopolamine, hyoscyamine, and several related tropane alkaloids in concentrations that vary between individual plants, between parts of the same plant, and between the same plant in different growing conditions. There is no reliable way to determine from external observation how potent any given specimen is. The margin between a ceremonial dose and a lethal dose is narrow and invisible. Ethnographic records from across the Americas document deaths in ceremonial datura contexts. Those deaths were not always considered failures of the ritual. In some traditions, they were considered successful crossings. But here's where the global distribution of datura ritual forces a question that cultural diffusion cannot easily answer. The Zuni of New Mexico administered datura specifically to individuals designated as communicators with the dead, who would consume the plant before attempting to receive messages from deceased ancestors on behalf of the community. The Aztec priestly class used tlapotl in funerary rites designed to accompany the dead on their journey to Mictlan and establish terms of communication between the dead and those left behind. In South Asia, practitioners of certain Shaivite traditions used datura in cremation ceremonies intended to keep the boundary between mourners and the newly dead temporarily open. In the ancient Mediterranean, datura was associated with Hecate, the goddess who presided over the boundary between the living and the dead, worshipped at crossroads, at graveyards, in the dark. The same plant, the same application. 4 continents. Cultures with no documented contact at the time the associations developed. What the Chumash initiate saw below the rock art, what the Zuni communicator experienced before bringing a message back, what the practitioners at Hecate's crossroads approached in the dark, the pharmacological mechanism producing those experiences is the same. Datura's alkaloids produce the most complete dissolution of ego boundary known to plant pharmacology, not distortion of the self's perception of reality, dissolution of the self's awareness of being a separate thing from everything else. The white trumpet flowers of Datura rhydi still open after sunset in the Santa Barbara Hills, each one lasting a single night. The ceremonies that documented what they led to were interrupted 2 centuries ago. The plant. Number 6. Fly agaric. In 1957, amateur mycologist R. Gordon Wasson published a photograph essay in Life magazine titled Seeking the Magic Mushroom. It would become one of the most consequential popular science publications of the 20th century, but it was not the psilocybin mushrooms of Oaxaca that Wasson considered most significant to the history of religion. It was the red-capped mushroom he had been studying in parallel, Amanita muscaria, and its potential relationship to the sacred drink described in the oldest sacred literature in any Indo-European language. The Rig Veda, Soma, the drink of the gods, the drink whose recipe walked out of history 3,000 years ago. Wasson's research, published in 1968 in a volume titled Soma, Divine Mushroom of Immortality, proposed that the pressed filtered drink described in over 100 Vedic hymns was derived from Amanita muscaria, not from any plant, but from a mushroom that grows in the forests of Siberia, and that the Proto-Indo-European peoples who composed the Rig Veda may have carried with them as they migrated south and west from the steppe. The proposal remains contested, but it directed attention to a practice already documented with certainty, the Siberian shamanic tradition of Amanita muscaria, use for communication with the dead, which has been operating in continuous documented practice from at least the 18th century to the present day. The mushroom is unmistakable, a scarlet cap 3 to 8 inches across, covered with white flakes that are the remnants of the veil enclosing the young mushroom. It rises from the moss beneath birch and pine in the forest zones of the northern hemisphere. The Evenki, the Koryak, the Chukchi of Siberia, and the Sami of northern Scandinavia all incorporated it into shamanic ceremonies ceremony for the same purpose, to allow the shaman, the person designated to traverse the boundary between the living and the dead, to make that traversal. The chemistry is unlike anything else on this list. Amanita muscaria does not contain psilocybin, DMT, mescaline, or any tryptamine or phenethylamine alkaloid modern pharmacology associates with classical psychedelic experience. Its active agents are ibotenic acid and muscimol, compounds that act on GABA receptors, the brain's primary inhibitory system, rather than serotonin pathways. The effect profile is categorically different from classical psychedelics. Perceived alterations of size and scale, the sensation of flight, complete dissolution of the boundary between the waking self and the dreaming self, encounters with entities, with deceased individuals, with presences the user cannot locate within ordinary taxonomy. Practitioners consistently describe these encounters as more real than waking reality, not as real, more real. But here's where the Siberian practice becomes impossible to classify as straightforward consumption of an available intoxicant. Ibotenic acid, the compound dominant in raw Amanita muscaria, is neurotoxic. The mushroom, as consumed without preparation, produces nausea, convulsions, and in sufficient doses death. The Siberian shamans understood this. They also understood, without access to pharmacology, that the human body metabolizes ibotenic acid into muscimol and excretes that muscimol largely intact through urine. The mushroom could be pre-metabolized. The toxic load could be separated from the visionary one. The mechanism was the reindeer. Reindeer actively seek Amanita muscaria in the wild. They dig through snow to reach it. They display behavioral changes that ethnographers describe as intoxicated, staggering through drifts, standing motionless, staring at the horizon. The shamans collected the urine of reindeer that had eaten the mushroom, or the urine of humans who had consumed it first, and drank it. The muscimol passed through the animal's kidneys and emerged cleansed of most of the toxic ibotenic acid. They had, without knowing what a molecule was, invented biological fractional distillation. In the shamanic accounts of what the mushroom opened, across the Evenki, the Koryak, the Chukchi, traditions separated by hundreds of miles and centuries of independent development, the consistency is striking. The ancestors are there. They communicate. They provide information specific enough to act on. The shaman's function was not to have a spiritual experience. It was to deliver a message service between the living and the dead, and to return with something verifiable. What the shaman actually encountered in that territory is documented in the accounts that ethnographers of the 18th and 19th centuries recorded from Siberian informants. The accounts are specific in a way that generic trance descriptions are not. The ancestors appear as themselves, as recognizable individuals, dressed as the informant knew them in life, speaking in their own voices. They give instructions. They resolve disputes that have been carried by the living for years. They answer questions about the cause of illness, about where animals have gone, about what the community's dead require of those still living. The shaman returns, and the community holds the shaman accountable for what was retrieved. If the information is wrong, the shaman's authority diminishes. The system was not merely spiritual, it was empirical. It was tested against results. The mushroom still grows beneath the birches of Siberia. The reindeer still dig for it through the snow. The shamans who understood how to navigate what had opened are fewer now. The knowledge they held, accumulated across 4,000 years of practice in one of the harshest landscapes on Earth, was always carried by very few people and passed personally. It is passing into silence. Number 5. Yopo. In July of 1800, Alexander von Humboldt was traveling along the Orinoco River in what is now Venezuela when he witnessed a ceremony he recorded with the precision he brought to everything. The Otomic people consuming a powder they called Neo. Humboldt described the delivery system, a Y-shaped tube of bone with the forked end inserted into the nostrils and the single end held in the mouth of a second person, and the physical response that followed. The recipient's face flushed. Tears ran from the eyes. Mucus poured from the nose. And then, within less than a minute, the person was no longer present in any functional sense that Humboldt's naturalist vocabulary could account for. He could see the body. The body was still there. Something else was not. The substance is now classified under two names depending on the tradition using it: Yopo in the broader anthropological literature, Ebena in the Yanomami tradition of Venezuela and Brazil. The seeds of Anadenanthera peregrina, a leguminous tree native to South America, are roasted until they blacken, ground against stone, then mixed with an alkaline ash derived from burned tree bark or shells. The ash is chemically essential. Without it, The active compounds cannot cross into a form the body can absorb across the nasal mucosa. The preparation encodes specific chemical knowledge that this seed, treated this way, with this additional element, will produce this result, without which the drug does not work at all. The seeds contain bufotenin and dimethyltryptamine. Both are tryptamine compounds. Both produce, when they reach the bloodstream, a dissolution of ordinary consciousness so complete and so rapid that Humboldt, watching from outside the ceremony, did not have a category for what he was observing. The archaeological record places this practice in South America far earlier than 1800. In 2015, a multidisciplinary team working at the site of Arroyo Seco II in Buenos Aires province, Argentina, reported the recovery of a bone snuff tube from a burial layer dated to approximately 2600 BCE. The tube's interior carried chemical residues consistent with anadenanthera alkaloids. This pushed confirmed use of yopo to nearly 5,000 years before Humboldt's account on the Orinoco. Other deposits from Andean rock shelters suggest the practice extends to at least 4,000 BCE. But here's where the yopo ceremony becomes something pharmacology alone cannot contain. Among the Yanomami, Ibina is used specifically for communication with the dead. The Shipori, the shaman, uses the substance to travel to the realm of the Hikura, the spirits of deceased human beings, and of the non-human presences that inhabit the territory between this world and the next. The purpose is not visionary experience. It is information retrieval. The Shipori goes to where the dead are, asks them what they know, and comes back with specific answers about illness, about the location of game, about the intentions of neighboring groups, about what specific deceased individuals want the living to do. This is a transaction, not an experience. The social architecture the ceremony requires is itself notable. The substance cannot be effectively self-administered. The delivery method demands a partner. Whoever holds the tube holds the dose. Whoever receives the dose surrenders entirely. The ceremony is an act of trust built directly into the pharmacology. 6,000 years of dead communication through a tube of bone. The compound that makes it possible was understood and deliberately prepared across that entire span by people who would not have recognized the word alkaloid. They just knew what it did. Number 4. The Kaikion. In 2019, a team of researchers led by archaeochemist Enriqueta Macerando published findings in the Journal of Archaeological Science from excavations at a site associated with the El Argar culture in Menorca, Spain. Inside a ceramic vessel dated to approximately 1100 BC, they identified ergot alkaloids, compounds derived from Claviceps purpurea, the fungal pathogen that colonizes cereal grain and contains, among other compounds, lysergic acid amide. In the same vessel, traces of beta-lactoglobulin, a protein marker for barley beer. It was the first direct chemical evidence of ergot in an ancient European ritual drink. Not theoretical, not inferred from historical texts. Chemical confirmation, in a Bronze Age vessel, that someone in the Western Mediterranean had been deliberately incorporating the ergot fungus into a ceremonial beverage 3 centuries before the Eleusinian mysteries reached their classical form. The Eleusinian mysteries ran continuously for nearly 2,000 years, from approximately 1500 BCE to 392 CE, when the Christian emperor Theodosius ordered the sanctuary destroyed. In the small town of Eleusis, 14 miles northwest of Athens, generation after generation of initiates walked the sacred way from the city, fasted for a prescribed period, and descended into underground chambers carved into the bedrock of the Attic plain. There they received a drink called the Kaikion. Its documented ingredients, barley, water, and mint, should have produced nothing, a peasant's gruel. By every reasonable pharmacological standard, it should have been a meal, not a sacrament. And yet, Plato was an initiate, Cicero was an initiate, Aeschylus, Pindar, Sophocles, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, Plutarch. Every significant mind of the classical world traveled to Eleusis to drink it, and emerged describing the experience as the single most important event of their lives. Cicero wrote that Athens had given the world many extraordinary things, but nothing greater than the myth that they had taught not merely how to live, but how to die with hope. These were not the words of men experiencing meditation. They were describing something they had seen. But here's where the Eleusinian secret finds its pharmacological address. In 1978, Albert Hofmann, who had synthesized LSD in 1943, and who understood better than anyone alive what the ergot molecule could do to human consciousness, co-authored a book with classical scholar Carl Ruck at Boston University and ethnobotanist Gordon Wasson. Their argument, the kykeon was powered by a controlled ergot preparation. The barley of Attica, grown in the Mediterranean climate, would have been routinely contaminated with Claviceps purpurea. The hereditary Eumolpidae priesthood, who guarded the Eleusinian rite across 2 millennia, may have possessed exact knowledge of which contaminated grain to use and how to extract the psychoactive alkaloids while leaving the toxic ones, the same toxic alkaloids that in uncontrolled form produced the gangrenous mass deaths of St. Anthony's fire across medieval Europe. The Minorca finding confirmed that someone had this knowledge before Eleusis reached its classical form. What the initiates were being guided toward, under the ergot in the underground chambers, was not philosophical insight as an abstraction. The Eleusinian mysteries centered on Persephone, who had crossed into the underworld and returned, and Demeter, who had pursued her. The rite was an enacted crossing. The initiates did not study the myth. Whatever the kykeon produced in the body of a fasting initiate in an underground room lit by torches, it produced an encounter with the boundary the myths described, the boundary between the living and the dead, that was sufficiently real to make Cicero claim it had changed his relationship with death entirely. What the initiates were actually encountering in those chambers is described in fragments, in texts that circle the experience without entering it. Sophocles, who was an initiate, wrote that thrice blessed are those mortals who see these rites before departing for Hades, for they alone have life there, and for everyone else all things are evil. Not a philosophical observation, a direct claim about what the initiates saw, that on the other side, the initiated dead have life, and the uninitiated dead do not. The ceremony was apparently producing an experience of the afterlife specific enough to make a distinction between different qualities of existence in it. Plutarch, in his fragment on the soul, described the process of dying as identical to the experience of Eleusinian initiation. The soul at death undergoes exactly what the initiate undergoes, he wrote, which, interpreted at face value, means the kykeon produced the phenomenological state of actual dying and recovery from it, a rehearsal of the boundary crossing that the initiate would eventually make permanently. The Eumolpidae family's recipe was destroyed when the sanctuary burned in 392 C. The barley fields of Attica still grow. The ergot still blooms on the grain in spring. The Minorca vessel, with its chemical conformation, sits in a museum. The encounter the kykeon produced in those underground chambers has not been reproducible for 16 centuries. Number 3. Iboga. In 2008, the Bwiti tradition of initiation was inscribed by UNESCO on the representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity. The inscription recognized a practice centered in Gabon, Cameroon, and the Republic of Congo that involves the administration of the root bark of Tabernanthe iboga in quantities sufficient to produce what practitioners describe, plainly and without metaphor, as a journey to the land of the dead. The Bwiti do not say the initiate sees visions of the dead. They say the initiate goes there. Tabernanthe iboga is a shrub of the equatorial rainforest understory, reaching heights of 4 to 6 feet, producing clusters of pale flowers and small orange. The alkaloid ibogaine is concentrated in the root bark, which is scraped, dried, and consumed in the Bwiti initiation ceremony, the ibogaine, in amounts that ceremony leaders carefully calibrate through decades of practice. The microdose produces stimulant effects. The ceremonial dose is orders of magnitude larger. The ceremony lasts 36 hours. Ibogaine's pharmacology is unlike anything else in the clinical or ethnographic literature. The compound acts simultaneously on dopamine, serotonin, sigma, and opioid receptor systems in a pattern modern neuroscience has not fully characterized. Its most clinically distinctive feature is its ability to produce what researchers classify as a complete life review state. The initiate experiences a comprehensive chronological review of their own life, rendered with a vividness exceeding ordinary memory, followed by what practitioners describe as a transition into the territory of the dead. The cardiac risk is severe. Ibogaine lengthens the QT interval in the heart's electrical cycle, which can produce fate. The Bwiti ceremony leaders monitor this. They have developed over generations of practice techniques for observing the initiate's physical state and adjusting the ceremony in response to physiological signals that are functionally equivalent to what a cardiologist would need to monitor the same procedure safely. Without knowing the term Keat interval, they understand its consequences. But here's where the iboga experience separates itself from every other substance on this list. Every other ceremony described here produces an encounter with the dead mediated by vision, by presence, by a sense of contact. The Bwiti ceremony produces something more specific. Initiates report traveling through a physical corridor into a domain they describe as the actual location of the dead. There, they encounter not archetypes or symbolic presences, but specific deceased individuals, grandparents, parents, community members who have died. The conversations are specific. The deceased provide information. They deliver messages that are, in a number of documented cases, verifiable. Information about events the initiate could not have known, about objects buried or hidden, about circumstances of death not disclosed to the initiate before the ceremony. The Bwiti do not claim iboga produces the experience of speaking with the dead. They claim it produces the actual thing. The documentation for this comes from multiple independent researchers across decades of fieldwork. Anthropologist James Fernandez, who conducted fieldwork among the Bwiti and Gabon in the 1960s, and published his findings in the 1982 monograph Bwiti, an ethnography of the religious imagination in Africa, documented initiate accounts with the precision of someone who had witnessed the ceremonies repeatedly and recorded what participants reported before and after. The consistency of the accounts across initiates who had not spoken to one another about what they were about to experience was the detail Fernandez found most difficult to explain. The specific deceased individuals encountered, the specific information provided, the specific instructions given, these were not generic encounters with an abstract spirit world. They were, by the initiate's accounts, meetings with particular people who had died, in a particular place, with particular things to say. Deborah Mash's pharmacological research at the University of Miami in the 1990s established that ibogaine produces neurological states distinct from all other known psychoactive compounds. What those states make accessible, what they open, remains outside the current framework of neuroscience to fully explain. The Bwiti have been conducting this ceremony for at least 4 centuries of documented history. The same claim, made consistently for all of that time. The shrub is still growing in the Gabonese forest. The ceremony is still conducted. The dead are still said to be there when the initiate arrives. Number 2. Ayahuasca. In 1999, ethnobotanist Luis Eduardo Luna at Kyborg University published a calculation that had been sitting in the ethnobotanical literature for years without anyone treating it as the anomaly it is. The Amazon basin contains approximately 80,000 plant species. The probability of randomly selecting Banisteriopsis caapi and Psychotria viridis, 2 specific species from that population, determining that one must be combined with the other, and discovering that the combination produces a profound psychoactive effect that neither produces alone, is, as Luna wrote, functionally indistinguishable from zero when chance alone is the operative mechanism. The vine is not orally psychedelic by itself. The leaf is inert by itself. DMT, the active compound in the leaf, is destroyed by monoamine oxidase in the gut before it can reach the bloodstream. Eat the leaf without the vine, and nothing happens. The vine contains harmine and harmaline, which are monoamine oxidase inhibitors. They suppress the enzyme that would otherwise destroy the DMT. Combine the 2 plants, boil them for hours, and the result delivers orally active DMT into the human nervous system for the first time, a pharmacological outcome that requires understanding, at some functional level, enzyme inhibition and bioavailability. Without access to those concepts, the direct archaeological evidence places intentional ayahuasca use at a minimum of 1,000 years ago. In 2010, a research team published chemical analysis of a leather pouch recovered from a rock shelter in southwestern Bolivia, dated to approximately 1000 C, belonging to a shaman of the Tiwanaku culture. Inside, cocaine, bufotenin, harmine dimethyltryptamine, the specific combination of harmine and DMT, the MAO inhibitor with the tryptamine it disinhibits, is the pharmacological signature of ayahuasca, the oldest direct evidence of the brew's ingredients. But here's where the mystery of the brew's origin becomes genuinely resistant to resolution. When ethnobotanists and anthropologists have asked contemporary Amazonian shamans how their ancestors discovered the combination across the Shipibo, the Shuar, the Sequoia, the Coffin, and dozens of other traditions, the answers do not satisfy Western expectations. The plants told us is the most common response. The vine showed us how to prepare it. We learned in ceremony. The shamans are not being evasive. They are providing the account they received. The brew's origin is attributed across multiple independent traditions to the brew itself. What the ayahuasca ceremony is used for is as consistent as the preparation method. The ceremony is specifically structured around communication with the dead. The spirit world the brew opens is understood as the domain of the deceased ancestors, recently deceased community members, the spirits of individuals whose knowledge the shaman needs. The ceremony includes specific protocols for addressing the recently deceased, for relaying messages between the living and those who have, for resolving matters left unfinished at death. In the forests of the Amazon, the vine still climbs, the leaf still grows beneath it. The ceremonies that began at some unknowable moment when someone understood that these two things combined would open the door are still being conducted in the dark. Number 1. Soma. In 1876, the German Indologist Max Miller completed the first full English translation of the Rig Veda and encountered, in the 120 hymns dedicated to Soma, a problem that has not been solved in the century and a half since. The hymns are specific. They describe the preparation with what appears to be exact detail. The stalks are crushed between two stones. The juice runs yellow-green. It is filtered through sheep's wool, mixed with milk or water, offered first to the sacred fire and then to the priests. The ritual context is documented with the precision of a practitioner who has performed this many times. The plant is nowhere identified. Miller proposed Sarcostemma viminale, a climbing milkweed with no documented psychoactive properties. Subsequent researchers proposed ephedra, Amanita muscaria, Syrian rue, Peganum harmala, cannabis, Nymphea lotus, multiple species of psilocybe, and several others. Every candidate fits some aspects of the Vedic description and fails others. The debate has consumed a century and a half of scholarly energy and has not converged. What the hymns describe, independent of any identification dispute, is a drink that transforms the relationship between the drinker and death. The Soma hymns are not devotional literature in the abstract sense. They are descriptions of an experience. The drinker becomes luminous. The drinker becomes deathless. Indra consumed Soma before his defining act of cosmic creation, the slaying of Ritra and the release of the cosmic waters. The hymns consistently place Soma at the boundary between the living and the pitchers, the honored ancestral dead, and describe the drink as the mechanism of crossing, not metaphorically. The hymns treat Soma as the literal pharmacological key to the door between the living and the dead. And then, the key was lost. Between the composition of the Rig Veda, approximately 1500 to 1200 BCE, and the consolidation of classical Sanskrit tradition, the identity of the Soma plant disappeared from the knowledge of those who maintained the Vedic ritual. Not from the ritual itself. The ritual continued. Later Vedic texts describe surrogates being substituted, other plants pressed in the same way, producing similar colors of juice, maintaining the structural form of the ceremony, while the specific pharmacological agent was replaced by something chosen because no one any longer knew what they were looking for. By the time the first great commentators were writing on the Vedic texts, in the early centuries C, they were already uncertain about what Soma had been. They were certain about what it had done. The most intriguing archaeological lead came in 1994, when Soviet-era archaeologist Viktor Sarianidi reported the excavation of a site called Togolok 21 in what is now Turkey in the ancient region of Bactria Margiana. In rooms that appeared to serve a ritual function, Sarianidi found large ceramic vessels with filtering systems and chemical residue that he identified as ephedra, cannabis, and poppy. The combination was dated to approximately 2000 BC and lay directly in the geographical corridor through which the Proto-Indo-European migrations would have passed. The Togolok 21 complex was not a house or a storage facility. It was a temple, with rooms whose architecture appeared specifically designed for the preparation of a drink. Sarianidi proposed this was direct archaeological evidence of Soma preparation. The proposal was contested immediately. The chemical identification was disputed. The interpretation of the architecture was challenged. The debate about Togolok 21 is not resolved. What is not disputed is that the site exists, that it is the right age and the right location, and that it contains rooms apparently designed for the ritual preparation of a multi-plant drink. Whatever was being prepared there, it was being treated as sacred. The priests who built those filtering rooms and maintained those preparation vessels understood what they were doing with enough precision to construct purpose-built architecture around the process. And then, like the ceremony at Eleusis and the ayahuasca tradition before the leather pouch, the site was abandoned, and the practice that produced it moved on. or changed, or simply stopped. In 2003, pharmacologist David Spess proposed in his monograph Soma, the Divine Hallucinogen, that the Rig Veda's descriptions were consistent not with a single plant, but with a combination preparation, a multi-plant formulation in which no individual component would satisfy any single botanical identification, but whose combination would produce the effects the hymns describe. This would explain why every single plant candidate fails. It would also make the loss more comprehensible. If Soma required knowledge of a specific preparation involving multiple plants in precise combination, the loss of any single element of that knowledge could have made the drink unreproducible. But here's what makes Soma the most haunting case in the history of sacred pharmacology. Every other substance on this list is either still in use, chemically confirmable in archaeological deposits, or documented in a continuous living tradition. Soma is none of these. It is known only through text, through hymns that describe with evident precision what the drink did to the human relationship with death, while omitting, whether by intent or by the assumption that the reader already knew, what it was made from. It is the pharmacological equivalent of a recipe whose ingredient list has been replaced with descriptions of what the food tastes like. The practitioners who pressed the stalks knew the plant by sight, by texture, by the specific color its juice ran when fresh. They did not think to write that down. They were writing hymns. The hymns were for future priests who would already know the plant, who would learn it as apprentices learn from masters, in the field, by hand. The chain broke. We do not know where. We do not know when the last person who knew the correct plant died, or whether they understood, in that dying, that the knowledge was going with them. 3,500 years later, the ceremony still exists. The words of the Rig Veda hymns to Soma are still recited by Brahmin priests in ceremonies conducted with meticulous attention to the form of the original. They press a plant that may or may not be what was pressed in 1500 BCE. They filter the juice through wool. They offer it to the fire. They drink what remains. The ceremony is the same ceremony. The drink is not the same drink. And no one alive, in any tradition, anywhere in the world, knows what the drink was. What connects these 10 substances is not their chemistry, which varies across every receptor system the human brain possesses: opiates, deliriants, tryptamines, phenethylamines, ergot alkaloids, ibogaine compounds, each acting on different targets through different mechanisms, each requiring preparation techniques that in many cases encode knowledge modern pharmacology only formalized in the 20th century. The connection is the application. Every single one of them was used, in its primary ceremonial context, for the same purpose: contact with the dead, not as metaphor, not as psychological processing of grief. The literal claim, made independently by Siberian shamans and Amazonian healers and Vedic priests and Greek initiates and Bwiti ceremony leaders across 4.5 millennia, is that these substances allowed the living to go to where the dead were, and to speak with them, and to return. The archaeological record is now confirming what the ethnographic record has always contained: the alkaloids in the Minorca vessel, the leather pouch in the Bolivian rock shelter, the bone tube from Buenos Aires province, the henbane seeds in the Viking burial pouch. These are not superstition decorating a pharmacological reality. The pharmacology was the point. These substances were selected, refined, prepared, and administered with a precision that required deep empirical knowledge accumulated across generations, held in oral traditions and ceremony, maintained with the discipline of institutions that understood what they were protecting. The Eumolpidae family guarded a recipe for 2,000 years. The Bwiti ceremony leaders calibrate a cardiac risk without knowing the word cardiac. The Amazonian shaman holds a preparation method whose pharmacological sophistication cannot be explained by trial and error alone. These were not primitive peoples fumbling toward effects they could not understand. They were knowledge holders whose field was the boundary between the living and the dead. What is unsettling is not that ancient peoples believed in life after death. Every culture in history has believed that. What is unsettling is that they also had methods of getting there, methods whose chemistry we can now partially verify, methods whose consistent application to the same specific goal, the same boundary, in culture after culture, across every continent where these plants grow, has a coherence that cannot be fully accounted for by coincidence. There is also the Avestan parallel that Miller noted and no one has adequately explained away. The Zoroastrian sacred text, the Avesta, refers to a drink called Heoma in language that is linguistically identical to the Vedic Soma, the same word, the same ritual context. the same claimed effects, the same status as a divine entity that can be drunk. The Proto-Indo-Iranian peoples who split into the Vedic and Avestan traditions carried the knowledge of this drink with them when they separated. Both traditions maintained the ceremony. Both traditions lost the plant. The loss happened independently, in two separate branches of the same original tradition on the same timeline, which means the knowledge was fragile, not protected by institutional secrecy, not like the Eleusinian recipe, maintained intact for 2 millennia. Fragile, dependent on individual transmission from practitioner to practitioner, and failing twice in 2 separate cultures when that transmission was interrupted. The ceremony is the same ceremony. The drink is not the same drink. And no one alive, in any tradition, anywhere in the world, knows what the drink was. The plants are still growing. The fungi still bloom on the grain in spring. The vine still climbs through the Amazon canopy. The question the ceremonies were designed to answer has not been answered. It has been set aside. What the practitioners found, when the substances were prepared correctly and the ceremonies were conducted by people who knew what they were doing, what they actually encountered in the dark, on the other side of the boundary these drugs opened, is the part of this history that no amount of chemical analysis will ever fully recover. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.